Hi, my name is Dr. Lisa Cromer. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I'm an associate professor of psychology at TU, and most importantly, I'm a mom of a Jenks kid. And I volunteered to put this slideshow together along with one of my doctoral students, Devin Barlin, so that we could provide information for parents and educators alike, including the school board, about what we know in the literature, in the scientific research about school start times and about how sleep affects kids' health, learning, and athletic performance. So this is one of two slideshows. The slideshow you're about to see is about school start times. 1,000 different schools and 70 different school districts have already made this change, and researchers have looked at what the impact's been on kids. So that's what you're about to see. So one of the reasons I'm so interested in sleep is that for the last 6 years, I've been working with the University of Tulsa athletes to help them excel in the classroom and on the field or on the court. And so you see a couple logos here. So one is SHAPE, that's the Student Health, Athletic Performance, and Education Project. And Titan, which is an interdisciplinary institute for trauma and resilience, and then the University of Tulsa. And so I do work across these institutes and projects, and a lot of that work has taken me to sleep and the importance of sleep. So when we're looking at sleep, it's very interesting that you'll hear a lot of folk knowledge in terms of how much sleep people need. And we often think of younger kids needing more sleep. What's actually true is that most of us on average need around 8 or 9 hours of sleep a night. It is the case that younger children, ages 6 to 13, may need as many as 11 hours. High school students need roughly 8 to 10 hours of sleep a night. The biggest difference between elementary and high school children is their sleep-wake cycle. And so the circadian rhythm, this is our biological clock that's actually determined by our brains. And with adolescents, their body's clock roughly tells them to go to bed at around 11 o'clock at night, and when left to their own devices, they'll get up at about 8 a.m. Whereas elementary school children, their natural body clocks are to get up much earlier. Sometimes we jokingly talk about this with parents that you've got an adolescent when, if your family celebrates Christmas, for example, you're dragging your kid out of bed Christmas morning to open the Christmas stockings, whereas when you've got younger kids, they're dragging you out of bed way earlier than you'd want to get up. And so, just even anecdotally, I think a lot of people have experience with this. So the 11 o'clock bedtime is one of the things to consider when we're looking at optimal school start times, because that correlates with kids, in order to get enough sleep, need to sleep a little bit later than what our younger children typically need to sleep. So in terms of just a little bit of background, it used to be the case that school start times coincided more with the light of day. But when education became more accessible for people back in the 1960s, more kids were going to school and staying in school longer, there was a greater demand for school start times to move earlier, in part to accommodate bus schedules and so that 2 bus rotations could go in. And it took until about the 1990s before anyone even started to look at, is there any information that should guide when school start times actually occur? And so the earlier schools that made changes were in districts that were in areas where universities and researchers were most knowledgeable about school, about what was optimal for kids. And so this was really, Minnesota is one of the key places for child development research. And so not surprisingly, the earlier school start time shift happened in Minnesota, and it happened in relation to urging by sleep scientists. In the 2000s, the National Sleep Foundation and the American Academy of Pediatrics both put out a call for schools to shift their start times because we were learning more and more in terms of the sleep science, as well as seeing evidence for the schools that had made changes that it was really beneficial to kids' health when we made changes. there is another slideshow that we're posting as well that talks even more about sleep and health. But we're going to tell you here just what we've learned from the 1,000 schools and 70 different school districts that have, for those schools that have done research, that what we can tell you about school start times and what we've actually learned. So later school start times is related to better academic performance. And so this is really key for us to be thinking about. When we're talking about middle schoolers and high schoolers, they have less tardies, they have better attendance overall, we have less truancy and fewer high school dropouts when school start times shift later. This is not correlational research comparing schools that are open late to schools that start late versus schools that start earlier. This is actually research that looks at these variables in schools that used to start early, say a 7 or 7:30 start time, and then that shifted to a later start time. We see improvement in academic grades and standardized test scores, and you see at the note here that it's slight improvements. Well, what we're basically looking at on a ACT or a GRE type test score, so these admission exams for college, for example, is maybe a 1 or 2 percentile improvement. So not huge, but at the same time, not entirely trivial. We see that in the research where school start times have shifted to later, that the surveys done of children in these schools, and again, we're looking typically at middle school and high schools. There isn't research on elementary, quite frankly. We have combed the literature and have not found any research on it. But we see that there's increased motivation to learn in the kids when the school start times shift, and that they have better attention and better concentration. When there is a shift in school start times, one of the most important findings is that kids sleep more. So a question that could potentially come up is, okay, where school start times are shifting, what if they shift from 7:30 until 8:30 or from 7:45 until 9:15? Is my kid actually going to get more sleep? And what the data tells us is, yeah, actually, it's true. In fact, some research studies have found that 67% of high schoolers are getting up to their alarms because of school start times being so early, but when left to their own devices on weekends, they rarely wake up to an alarm, but they still might get up at a reasonable time, say 9 o'clock. When school start times are shifted later, we see an improvement in sleep, which means we have an improvement in health. There's a really strong correlation between sleep and health. And so what we see for later school start times is less daytime sleepiness. We see a reduction in health center visits. So for schools that have health centers, and when kids are get referrals to go to the health center during the day, the schools that have these health centers note a decline in classroom referrals to the health center for kids after the school start times have shifted to a later time. Another really important finding is that from a public health perspective, we see far fewer automobile accidents when schools start later. And these are for the high schoolers who are driving to school. And so there's a great variability across studies, but we consistently see a decrease in accidents. And so on the low end, we see a decrease of 6% of morning accidents for adolescent drivers in Minnesota. And the greatest improvement was a 70% reduction in Wyoming. Now, the school in Wyoming was actually had a lot of commuter students or students who lived in rural areas. So they were also driving a further distance, which may also explain why there was a 70% reduction. Nonetheless, that shift to later school start times could save parents money on car insurance and could keep our kids safe. Mental health is really highly correlated to sleep. And in fact, as a clinical psychologist who teaches intervention research to our doctoral students, I can tell you that what the latest research is telling us to do when we're doing clinical treatment is that if there are comorbid symptoms, and so that I mean people are being treated for multiple disorders or a couple different problems that they come to see a clinician for, that if sleep is a possible indicator, we treat that first. And so if somebody comes in with post-traumatic stress disorder, but they also have nightmares, I am most likely to be treating those nightmares and get that patient sleeping before we start to address the post-traumatic stress disorder. So what we see, not surprisingly then, is that when school start times shift to later and kids are getting more sleep, we see decreases in depressed mood. We see fewer reports of suicide ideation, and so what that means is thoughts about suicide. We see students feeling less irritated and less annoyed, and far fewer disciplinary referrals. In terms of other costs and benefits, obviously there's a savings in public transportation when we do something like what Jenks is having to do with the buses and going to a 3-tiered system. But we also see that there's when the schools have made changes to school start times, that even though I think it's about 90% of parents are worried about athletics and violin lessons or swim lessons or whatever that may be, that the community is actually wrapped around the school, not the other way around. And so the other things that kids do adapt. And so very consistently when school start times shift, the community just makes that shift. And so kids are spending just as many hours in athletics, they're spending just as much time on extracurricular activities, they spend just as much time doing homework. And what schools, what the studies have found is that even though there's a lot of anxiety in anticipation of school start times, 92% of parents prefer the change. Interestingly, in this Owen study that's noted here, 75% of kids said that the ideal start time is 8:30 a.m. Now, the key thing here is that school shifted to an 8:30 start time, and basically the kids loved it and said it was ideal. But I'm going to get back to you in just a couple more slides about what ideal start times really should be. So, actually, I'm getting to it right now. So there is a study with over 9,000 teens that looked at multiple schools across a few different states. And what they found was that when they examined all of these different schools, and I didn't put all the data here because there were so many, we had 8 different schools here, I've just got highlights of 5, that when they looked at the different start times, what the researchers did was they looked at what proportion of these adolescents were actually getting at least 8 hours of sleep a night, which is the recommended amount of sleep. It's sort of a minimum. And so when school start times were 7:30 a.m., they found that 33.6% were getting 8 hours or more of sleep a night. And so you can see on this table across the bottom here that 8 a.m., where a few different schools had shifted to 8 a.m., and so their range was 44.5% to 49.7% of kids, so almost half were getting 8 hours of sleep. 8:20, we had a solid half were getting 8 hours of sleep. Bump that to 8:35, and we're at 57 to 60% are getting enough sleep. And then the latest school start time in this particular study was 8:55 a.m., and we see an increase again to 66.2% of adolescents were getting at least 8 hours of sleep a night. So to reiterate the point that was made, when we shift school start times, do kids sleep later? Absolutely. Now, I realize Jenks is making these changes anyways, that they need to because of the 3-tiered bus system. And, one of the questions is, well, who gets the latest start time? Who gets the earlier start time? And so we can certainly see that if there's earlier or if there's later start times, adolescents are getting the benefit of that later start time. There's no research to show would elementary kids get that start time, but I think anecdotally a lot of parents would say my kid gets up early, even on the holidays, or they get up at that set time. And so and I know I've heard from teachers that when school is extended, so a few years ago when we had the extended school day, when there was the snow days and we had to tack on, and gosh, I think Jenks Southeast, where my daughter was, the school went to almost 4 o'clock. Those kids were not getting the benefit of the longer school day because they were elementary kids and they are fatigued and ornery or squirrely by the end of the day. Now, this is an empirical question, so this is more my opinion as a parent in terms of what I've seen. But as a researcher, I'd love for us to collect some data and just kind of see how these kids are doing. Now, I wanted to just give you a chance to see some numbers too. So when we ask teenagers what they think, which is different than what, when we're looking at putting on sleep watches and what this research that looks actually at the physiology will say that the typical adolescent on average wants to go to bed at 11 o'clock at night. That's what their bodies tell them. But when students are asked, and so in this Wallstrom study, this was over 9,000 students were asked, these times in this first table here, you can see that for that like kind of 11 o'clock, there you have it right there, 35%, and then on either side of that. So, I call this a standard deviation, that we've got a standard deviation of about an hour that pretty much captures about 75% of our kids are going to want to go to bed between 9 o'clock and midnight. When these researchers asked kids what they thought the ideal school start time was, we see the modal response. So the most frequent percentage was 9 a.m. as an ideal school start time. And so, basically what we're looking at is that sort of 8:30, 9 o'clock is what the adolescents thought they would like. Interestingly enough, these researchers also asked high school students what they think is the best time to take a test. And I'm sure many of us can remember taking very early morning tests. And I know my daughter just took the ACT, and I think it was at around 7:30 a.m. start time. According to adolescents, how they're feeling and when they're feeling the most mentally sharp is between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m., which you see on this top table right here. So 60% thought this was the best time to be taking a test. And then in terms of the best time to do their favorite activities, they thought 3 to 5 p.m. was the best time to do their favorite activities. So that sort of after school range. So I thought that was interesting as well, and wanted to share that for all of you to think about. Okay, so when we first presented this information, and I say we, it was me and my graduate student, Devin Barlin, who's a first-year doc student in my lab. We had been asked a question by, I think there was 100 people in the room of teachers and coaches and parents from all of the different schools, really to represent a good mix in the community. And one of the most common questions was that people asked on their forms afterwards is, hey, you told us all the good stuff, but you didn't tell us the bad stuff, and you didn't tell us about younger kids. And so there's two things I want to say about that. First of all, we've really presented the research that's out there. And so ethically, I can't pick and choose, or it would be unethical for me to pick and choose. And so the information we're providing is the information that we have. And just it's overwhelming, the research to support that later school start times is best for kids' health, learning, and fitness. And the other question about, well, what about younger kids? And there just isn't any research on the younger kids. It's always been really focused on the middle schoolers and high schoolers. And so here's a table that I showed you at the very beginning, just to remind you. So it's like, well, what should we do with the younger kids? What would be optimal? And so when we look at optimal times for younger kids to wake up, it's variable, but it's very typical for younger kids to want to be getting up at around 6 a.m. So if we have the earlier school start times for the younger kids, that seems to be, it would be consistent with their biological clocks. Here I'm listing a bunch of references. This is the literature that we've cited